The Wild West was a land known for its lawlessness, and in the absence of reliable police forces or courts, vigilant justice often took over. In the harsh and rugged frontier towns, mobs of ordinary people would become the law. It wasn't always fair or measured. In fact, many suffered terrifying punishments, even if their crimes weren't proven. One notorious incident took place in Bannack, Montana, in the 1860s. The town was a hotspot for gold miners, and with the sudden influx of fortune seekers came a rise in crime. The group of people accused Henry Plummer, the town's sheriff, of secretly leading a gang of robbers. Although there was no solid proof, the vigilantes decided to take action. Plummer was dragged from his home, and within hours, he was hanged without a trial. Witnesses claimed he begged for his life, shouting his innocence, but his cries went unheard. This was not an isolated case. In California, during the gold rush of 1849, a man named Francisco Guerrero was accused of stealing a horse. In those days, horse theft was considered a severe crime, often punishable by death. Before any official judgment could be made, a mob seized Guerrero, tying him up and dragging him through the streets. People spat at him, cursed him, and called him names. Finally, he was hanged from a tree in a public spectacle. Later, it turned out that Guerrero may have been falsely accused, but by then, it was too late to reverse the damage. Vigilant justice wasn't just about hanging. In some towns, the mobs would go to extreme lengths to humiliate and hurt the accused. Hanging trees and the unforgiving rope. Hanging was one of the most feared punishments in the Wild West, and it happened so often that certain trees became infamous hanging trees. These gnarled old trees stood as grim reminders of the rough justice meted out in frontier towns, where being accused of a crime could quickly turn into a death sentence, regardless of whether the person was truly guilty. One of the most well-known hanging trees stood in Helena, Montana. This massive tree was said to have witnessed the deaths of dozens of men, often without fair trials. In 1864, a group of vigilantes called the Montana Vigilance Committee took justice into their own hands. They targeted a group of men suspected of being part of a notorious gang of road agents who robbed and killed travelers along the trails. One of the accused was George Ives, a known outlaw. Instead of facing a jury, Ives was dragged to the hanging tree. His trial was a hurried affair, held outdoors in freezing temperatures, with a crowd of armed men eager to see him swing. Despite Ives's desperate pleas and his insistence that he was innocent, he was sentenced to hang. The crowd watched in silence as he took his final breath, and the hanging tree became even more famous. Another tragic story took place in Texas, where a young man named Tom Ketchum, better known as Black Jack, met his end at the hands of the hangman's noose. In 1901, Ketchum was caught trying to rob a train and was quickly sentenced to death. The execution became a horrifying spectacle. The townspeople gathered in Clayton, New Mexico, to witness his hanging, but things went terribly wrong. The hangman had miscalculated the drop, and when the trapdoor opened, Ketchum fell so hard that the rope decapitated him. The crowd was horrified, and the gruesome incident became infamous in Wild West history. One of the eeriest tales comes from the infamous hanging judge, Isaac Parker, in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Judge Parker sentenced over 160 men to death during his career, and many of these executions took place on a massive gallows that could hang 12 men at a time. The gallows became a symbol of relentless justice, but it was far from fair. Many prisoners claimed they were innocent or hadn't received a proper trial. Yet once they stood under that scaffold, there was no escape. The rope tightened around their necks, and the crowd cheered as the floor dropped. It was said that some people came from miles away just to watch these mass executions. Tarring and feathering. Humiliation that burned. Tarring and feathering was one of the most painful and humiliating punishments inflicted in the Wild West. It was a form of public shaming meant to send a message. Step out of line, and you would pay the price, not just in physical pain, but in everlasting disgrace. The process involved pouring hot, sticky tar over a person's body and then covering them with feathers, turning the victim into a spectacle for the crowd. One chilling case happened in Kansas in the 1870s. A man named Joseph Henderson was accused of cheating his neighbors in a land deal. Outraged and feeling betrayed, the townsfolk decided to take matters into their own hands. They dragged Henderson from his house in the middle of the night, ignoring his screams and pleas for mercy. As the mob held him down, they poured scalding tar over his skin. The heat caused severe burns, and the thick tar clung to his flesh, making it nearly impossible to remove. The mob then dumped a sack of feathers onto him, and he was paraded through the streets, humiliated and in agony. Henderson survived but was left with permanent scars and a ruined reputation. The incident became a dark legend in the town, serving as a warning to anyone else who might try to deceive their neighbors. Rough rides and the gauntlet of pain. Life in the Wild West was unforgiving. And when frontier justice was served, it was often more about making people suffer than correcting wrongdoing. One of the most brutal punishments was being forced to endure a rough ride or running the gauntlet. These punishments weren't just physically painful, they left emotional scars that could last a lifetime. Imagine being tied up and dragged behind a horse for miles. The rough ride was exactly that, a punishment where the accused, often with their hands bound, was tethered to a galloping horse and pulled along the harsh, rocky terrain. The journey was brutal. Victims would be thrown across sharp rocks and prickly cacti, their bodies battered and bleeding by the end. In some cases, if the person managed to survive, they would be left severely injured and permanently scarred. In Arizona, a man named Samuel Brooks was accused of stealing cattle. The local ranchers decided not to wait for a trial. Instead, they tied him to a horse and set it loose. Witnesses said that by the time Brooks was released, he was barely conscious. Another frightening punishment was running the gauntlet, where the accused was forced to dash between two lines of men armed with sticks, whips, or clubs. As the person ran, they were beaten mercilessly, often collapsing before reaching the end. Sometimes, the gauntlet was used not just as punishment, but as a test of endurance and survival. If someone was suspected of being a criminal, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict them, they might be forced to run the gauntlet.